So today we're talking about land development basics and zoning basics. They're two very different but closely related topics, and they're also individually gigantic topics to talk about. But I'm just going to stick with just the basics today to sort of get an overview of what they even are, some definitions, things like that. Land use is also another term that's commonly used for land development, and land use they're sort of interchangeable. Zoning, by definition, refers to the laws and regulations that outline the specifics of land use and the process by which a zoning board designates what land use is permitted in a specific zone. Oddly, zoning is a really pretty new concept. The first actual zoning regulations were passed in Los Angeles in 1906. And the first comprehensive master plan with zoning regulations was implemented by New York City in 1916. So the concept of specific zoning of individual parcels is a pretty new concept. Land use planning is entirely the opposite. Land use planning predates writing. But most land use planning centered around transportation, ingress, egress, roads, height of buildings a little bit, but it was mostly about how people got to and from a certain place. It didn't really focus very much on the individual use of a parcel of land. The parcel of land concept is also fairly much newer as well. Ownership of land, it was more of a communal thing, or it belonged to a king. This is probably the most common ownership of land historically. And then the land use is the process of altering and improving land within the guidelines established by a master plan and zoning regulations. In a nutshell, zoning sets the rules. Land use is the outcome of those rules. Talked about a brief history of that. In most states, including Connecticut, state governments grant jurisdiction for zoning to boards. And there are over 200 boards in Connecticut. It can be a whole range of things, from towns, Town of Groton, City of New London, to the Conservation and Wetlands Commission, which is a very important and powerful board, but it's basically more or less a zoning board, and it has its power from state statutes, which don't deal directly with zoning, but empower entities to create zoning. Harbor commissions, port authorities, all of these entities are types of zoning commissions. Is that all your understanding of this kind of thing? Okay. There are, most of the information I read up on says there are 5 types of land use, 5 basic categories of land use. But they all mention a 6th and never count it as a 6th, and it's probably one of the largest governing bodies for land use, and that's municipal land use. Mm-hmm. Government property, public space, public waterfront, roadways, all of that is probably the 2nd largest zoned area in general. Agriculture, one of the others, is certainly probably the largest in land area because it deals with such large parcels of land. Industrial, commercial, residential, and mixed use. And mixed use is a concept as much as it is a zoning designation, because land use zoning in the United States, for the most part, has dealt with individual uses, the commercial, the residential, agriculture. Mixed use is somewhat common, but it's also a much newer concept to put multiple different types of zoning in the same area. The rest of the world, mixed use is by far and away the most common type of zoning, because they tend to have historically mixed those things, and to rezone 500-year-old towns is impractical. So they're already mixed use, so they just sort of use that concept already. And then you get into the minutia, zoning regulations and zoning codes. So zoning regulations actually deal with the categories of zoning. PUDs, planned unit developments, all the acronyms and the little R1, R2, all of those things are zoning regulations, and those are the overarching guide within the zones. And then zoning codes are the individual minutia that everyone runs up against barriers against. There are over 30,000 zoning codes in the National Zoning Atlas.
Holy cow.
Is everyone familiar with the National Zoning Atlas?
No.
No, you should look the National Zoning Atlas up. It's very cool. Zoningatlas.org. It's, I think it's University of Cornell developed it. And it's basically a map, sort of like the GIS, but when you hover and click on spaces, it actually gives you quite a bit of the actual zoning information, the minutia, some codes, regulations, things like that come up, as opposed to the GIS, which is more about an individual parcel. The
Is that
Atlas
state or is that local?
It's national.
It's national.
It's the entire country.
Wow.
When you pull it up, it's the whole, and you can just zoom in anywhere.
Yeah.
It's actually a really nice program. It's really well built and really modern, up to date
Good for due
software.
diligence.
Yeah, it would be. It's really. I was really intrigued. I just sort of surfed around it for quite a while. It was fun. All right, moving on to land development. There are basically 6 steps within land development. How those steps are undertaken is a matter of debate among developers, I've discovered. But they all somewhat interchange because they're all happening sort of in tandem with each other. The first thing is determining the feasibility of a project. Do you have the skill set amongst your group? Do you have an idea of what you want to build? All those things, the financing, you have to figure out whether you have all of this and whether putting all of it together in one project is of value. The next 2 are debated. Do you get the zoning and figure the zoning out first, or do you acquire the land and then force the zoning?
That's risky.
I hear about talk about risk.
Yeah, different developers have different opinions on that. Discovered.
A lot of times I think if it's an area that is prominently being developed and they're consistently changing codes, then people are a little bit more comfortable.
Certainly,
But
yeah.
They
Understanding the
always
zoning and
want
how
to
it's
have the
developed is
zoning
really
clear
important in the
first.
development process. You know, whether the zoning boards are amenable to change, whether variances have happened in the past. All of that is just background and due diligence.
In conversations with the town to
Yeah.
see, what
Absolutely.
are they looking for? It's really helpful.
Absolutely. Acquisition, financing is a big one. Often developers will have financing of some sort prior to undertaking a development. Oftentimes they may have to increase the financing when they get far enough along in a project that they have a better idea of how much it's going to cost. Again, all of these float.
Layers.
They're layers, they float. When you have a lot of those main things in place, you go into construction, the actual physical changing of the land, which is the improvements we always talk about in the real estate business. And marketing is a big component of any kind of developing, unless it's you building your own house. But thinking about the resale of that house is also a form of marketing, thinking about what you plan to do with it in the future, what marketability it might have out in the future, features, things like that. And marketing, I'm sorry.
Not overbuilding.
Not overbuilding, exactly.
Yeah, oversaturation and kill you every time.
Yeah. Building a
Build a
8,000 square foot house
house
next to 1,000 square foot houses.
It's gonna be
Yeah.
a detriment
We knew somebody
to the
that did that,
resale.
right? Like
Yeah.
years ago.
I've seen plenty of that. Yeah.
Put marble in the projects and get your money back.
Yeah, exactly. Drilling down further, there's quite a few. Well, there is an infinite number of things and little details to keep in mind. But some big ones are permitting, and the building department, which is separate from zoning. The zoning department and the permitting department work in tandem and very close together, but they are very different entities, and they do not overlap their sphere of influence. And knowing your permitting department can make or break an entire development or of any kind, for sure. The zoning regulations, doing the due diligence and research. Carrying costs is, I think, a huge thing that novice developers, homeowners building their own property, things like that, fail to really get their mind around the time frame and financing that time frame, where you're going to be, what you're going to do, where the money's going to come from, because depending on how big the development is, that time frame can be very long. I built a house in a foreign country. It took 18 months.
Wow.
It's just how it happens on an island.
I renovated a house 3 years.
I'm currently renovating a house. We've owned it for a year and a half, and I'm not anywhere close to being done with it. Utilities, and not just the utilities for the finished product, the utilities for the construction. Can you get the power in and use the power in the right way for your construction project? Do you have water? Do you need water? All of those things that you may think about in the finished product, but are part of the construction and the development product as well. Streets, outside streets, ingress, egress, access within the property, what that looks like, whether you're building a subdivision and you have to put in roads and utilities as the first step, or just the getting in and out of your parking lot for a small business.
Curb cuts.
Yep, curb cuts, all of those things. And watching the market, this is something that's mentioned repeatedly by developers that is often missed, is watching the market during the construction process. Things change on a dime, and a development may suddenly lose its feasibility or have reduced profitability while it's being constructed. We were talking about that this morning.
Building costs. Right?
Yeah.
Building costs.
Building costs may suddenly go up, and that's a big deal. And oftentimes, if a developer gets in the weeds with the project itself, they may not be paying attention to the winds of the market, and they may suffer down the road by not being flexible and able to pivot in any way that's feasible during the project.
The other experiences, one we've gone through, is the density that was allowed or not allowed in a development, causing the developers to go belly up because they didn't create a higher density. You can always go to lesser density with most towns. They love that. But it's harder to go backwards and get a higher density.
Yeah, that's a zoning code in most places.
Yeah.
Actually, it's easier to go higher, right? So go from an R20 to an R80 than go from an
That's what I
R80
meant.
to an R20.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And that's what I have for the basics.